We're going to start with public comment, and it's my understanding that we have Bruce Northcott, the superintendent for Daggett.
Yes, I am Bruce Northcott, superintendent of Daggett School District. I want to speak in favor of the 4-day school week issue. We have had the 4-day school week now in our community for the second time, and in the second time it's now 11 years. We think that this is a really good thing for our community. So we're a small, rural, isolated community. The school district is about 200 kids, K-12. We have students who come to us and pay tuition from Wyoming. And so when I say 200, if you look on your stats, it's going to say that we're smaller than that, but you only see the Utah count, you don't see the Wyoming count also. At any rate, when we first did this, the rules were that we could get a waiver of the 180 days, but we couldn't get a waiver of the 990 hours required. And so we've had great fidelity to that. And in order to make the day not extremely longer, we did things like we cut the number of minutes for lunch. We cut the number of minutes in the high school for the passing time between classes. Those kinds of things. And yes, the day did get longer, but we didn't cut out any instruction. So we have been true, and even now that you have relaxed the rule on the 990 hours, I didn't tell my community that. And I insist, as a superintendent, that we be true to that. Because even if you were doing 990 hours with 180 days, 180 days isn't long enough, 990 hours isn't long enough to get the curriculum done. Okay, I'm not going to steal anything more from instruction. Even though it's permissible, I'm going to hold to that rule. Also, in years past, part of the rule was that if you've got a 4-day school week, then you can't travel for sports, for example, on a Tuesday. And we don't. Now, there's certain things I can't control. I can't control when the state basketball tournament is. I can't control when the FFA state convention is. But all the other things that I can control, I do control. And I get regular requests, can we go to a track meet on Tuesday? The answer is no. Can we even have a home basketball game on a Tuesday? The answer is no. Because if you're in the gym till 10 o'clock, you won't have done your homework, and that will affect the next day's instruction. And so, from an athletics point of view, we are student athletes, student in capitals, athlete not, and emphasis on student. Here's another thing that we do in Daggett. I don't know, other people I don't think do this, and I've been told, well, Bruce, this is an issue of scale. Okay, well, I can do it. Every Monday, I check grades. Every kid who's on a sports team, every kid in the high school. And our high school is a junior-senior high school, grades 7 through 12. Seniors walking in the same hall as 7th graders. We check, principal checks, counselor checks, grades every Monday. And we also have a no-zero policy. So if you have got a 0 on an assignment, then you're going to go to remediation class, which for us is 6th hour. And if you don't have your stuff fixed by Thursday, by golly, you're not playing ball on Friday and Saturday. So there are ways to hold, and part of this is all stuff that you asked me to do in the first place. And we're doing it with fidelity. We have incredible success with that. This is a real blessing to my community, because if we do travel on a Friday and we're in school, the schools are going to be pretty well empty because the whole community travels with the team. And so it does affect instruction. So let's get all the instruction done on Monday through Thursday, and then we can turn our attention, whether it's home or away, because if we have home games, it's all day, right? And we have multiple gyms, but we can, everybody wants to be in the feature gym, da-da-da-da. But it's still going to be a 5 or 6 hour deal, right? Even for home, of course, for home games, because we're going to do a varsity or a freshman, a JV girls, a JV boys, a varsity girls, varsity boys, right? We're going to do all that together. So, anyways, this is a great blessing, a great idea for us. Our attendance has improved. We used to be the poster child for chronic absenteeism. That's another conversation that we could have. There's supposed to be a correlation between attendance and graduation rate. Okay, that may be true nationally, but I got called by the newspaper. We wanted to comment about chronic absenteeism. I'm sorry, I'm wandering here. And I said, I have 100% graduation. Do you have any other questions? So it's not about seat time, because I have a no zeros policy, right? I don't care when you got that done, but you're going to get it done and graduate. And I have interventionists who help with that. They get it done. And, this last year, first quarter, we had 3 Fs. Second quarter, 0 Fs. Third quarter, 0 Fs. Fourth quarter, 0 Fs. 100% graduation. Oh, every once in a while we have something weird happen and I don't get my 100%, and I'll drop down to 89 because each kid is worth 11%. Anyways, I'm rambling. But you can tell I'm passionate about 4-day school week, and I'm passionate about a whole bunch of other things. And I invite you to come and visit Daggett. And first off, you get to smell the air in heaven. And I've been teasing Rod here about coming to see how it really works. It's different, okay? It's different. People come and say, Bruce, this isn't like on the Wasatch Front. I remember when President Stuart Adams, he wasn't president at the time, came with the governor to Manila, you could just see the steam coming out his ears, right? And he finally turns to me and says, how do you do this? He's talking about run a full high school in a high school plant that would fit in his gymnasium, right? Oh, it's different. But there's fidelity to the pieces that count. Kids are getting a great education. I have at one point, the highest placement of students in the medical profession on a per capita basis. What are we doing special? We make them go to class. We make them do all their assignments. There's no impediment to graduating from a rural school that has great access to concurrent enrollment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Great CTE program. You want to see a great CTE program? Come and visit me. Okay? I'm rambling. Sorry. Anybody have any questions?
Yeah, Superintendent, we typically don't do questions from the body unless I'll make an exception today if somebody has something really pressing, but otherwise, thank you.
Great. Please come and visit me. You have to come, please.
Thank you, Superintendent.
Thank you. I'm going to stay here.
So it's my understanding that now we're going to hear from Ashley Beal, who has been researching the 4-day school week, and she'll be presenting some research and information that she's gathered to inform this committee. So.
Okay, good morning. Chair Carey, can you hear me okay?
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, awesome. I don't know if someone has the PowerPoint up there, whoever's driving. Um, I am just going to go through, or if they have it on PDF and backup. But I just did some research. I know there's been a lot of talk on 4-day school weeks, and so I'm just kind of presenting that as a for your information thing. So we'll start out. There was a study done in 2024 that aggregated five previous single state studies that were done in Oregon and Oklahoma, and then two multi-state studies that had covered Arizona, Georgia, Idaho, Kansas, Minnesota, Missouri, Montana, New Mexico, Nevada, Oklahoma, Oregon, and South Dakota. So this study in 2024 aggravated the results of all seven studies, and then they also did some new research on student achievement within the school year. All the previous studies had just looked at year to year changes. So a little background on the 4-day school week. Across the nation, we've seen a 600% increase in the 4-day school week over the past 2 decades. In 1999, there were approximately 257 schools across 108 districts. And in 2019, there were 1,607 schools across 662 school districts. So it's definitely been growing in popularity. And now the numbers they're estimating are over 2,100 in about 900 districts. The biggest reasons, according to that study, for moving to a 4-day school week were financial savings, attendance-related issues, as Superintendent Northcutt mentioned, and being in a rural area. The average weekly hourly decline in the districts was 3.8 hours per week, with declines ranging from 1 to 7 hours per week in educational hours. And the results looked at, so really quickly, I talked to Aaron Bruff about statistical significance, and he said that if there's a correlation on something, it means there's a correlation, it's related, but if it's not statistically significant, it doesn't mean that we can necessarily assign that correlation to a cause. So in the year-to-year achievement, there was a small negative effect on math scores, but it was not enough to rise to the level of statistical significance. But there was a statistical significance on reading scores. And then in the school year data from fall to spring, they found that there was statistically significant changes in both decreases in both math and reading scores, but reading higher so. But they also found, I think I'm going to get to that on the next one, yes, that rurality affected this, and that declines in rural schools were much less than non-rural schools or urban schools, to the point that even it became statistically non-significant in certain locations. I thought this was interesting, just as a note for Utah, that I think out of all of our schools on a 4-day week, we only have one that's considered an urban school, and the rest are all rural schools. So some specific factors that they looked at in the study
AG Beal,
was, yeah.
this is Chair Carey. Do we have, in your presentation, and thank you for the detail, do you have a breakdown of how you classify a rural school and a non-rural school?
You know what? I do not, but I can pull it from, so I don't know how they classified it in the study. I would have to go look. For our purposes, I was just looking at basically all the schools that are out of Salt Lake, Provo, Ogden kind of districts. So all of ours are like Daggett, Box Elder, like farther removed from the cities. I don't have a direct definition I was using there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So the specific factors they looked at in their study were the rurality, so non-rural 4-day weeks led to more significant decreases in math and reading, but there were no detectable effects in rural areas for reading or math, or they were non-statistically significant rather. So Grade levels, there was no significant differences based on grade levels that the study found. Gender, they didn't find a difference in year-to-year data, but in fall to spring data, they showed a greater negative impact on female students. And ethnicity, they found less negative impacts on Native American students and more negative impacts on Hispanic students compared to white students. So I don't know, where they're all, how they came up with everything, but that's kind of what that study found. And then I looked at one other study, which was done by a gentleman named Thompson. And this study compared the 4-day school week with other cost-saving policies for districts and schools. So it was more comparing it to things like increasing class sizes or hiring underqualified teachers, things that schools might have to do as an alternative to moving to a 4-day school week. So, for example, in their study, they found that the 4-day school week negatively impacted student achievement by 0.03 to 0.07 standard deviation. But compared to a vacant teaching post that could increase class sizes from 8 to 10 students, would create an achievement loss of 0.08 to 0.48 standard deviation. So their study kind of looked at that and found that the 4-day week was a better alternative than some of the other options that might be necessary in staffing in those schools. So that it was a more desirable alternative than leaving a position vacant or than hiring underqualified teachers. The study also looked at mitigation factors for what could mitigate any negative impacts of a 4-day week on achievement scores. And they found that instructional hours was a strong mitigation factor. Unfortunately, I wish that they had provided hours in their study of what they considered to be low school time, medium school time, and high school time. They didn't provide any kind of hours. They just took their whole study and they said the bottom 1/3 of schools in the study they considered to be low time in school, the middle 1/3 they considered to be medium time in school, and the top third they considered to be high time in school. I wish they had given us the actual hours. But they found that adequate time in school can negate potential negative impacts, achievement impacts that can come with a 4-day school week if they can carve out additional instructional time each day, or by offering optional services that students engage in on Fridays. And they found in this study that the average school day lasted 7 hours and 45 minutes on a 4-day week and 6 hours and 54 minutes on a 5-day week. So it was about a 50-minute difference on average for the 4-day week. And then they also looked at teacher retention. And so Oregon, I think this study specifically looked at Oregon because 40% of the schools in the state of Oregon are on a 4-day week. So it's a pretty high percentage. And they found that they had a 2.3% spike in turnover right after the adoption, but then it leveled out and was equivalent for the next 5 years. And then that there was a surge in turnover 5 to 9 years later that was 4% higher than the 5-day school week, but they kind of attributed that, it seemed like, to more retirement aged teachers. And then movement among mid-career teachers were what they attributed it to. And one thing I thought was interesting was they found that salaries in the 4-day school districts in Oregon tended to be lower. But I wondered how much of that was, because it was already some of the rural schools, and if those districts just paid less to begin with, and that wasn't addressed. So, and then I sent a survey out to all of the superintendents and principals in Utah that are on the 4-day waiver, or the 180-day waiver, I should say. So it went out to 17 leaders. 15 of those are on a 4-day week. So the other 2 are just they're on the 180-day waiver. One's like an alternative schedule school, and then one was for a late start for the year. So of those 15, I got 10 responses. And the respondents that that responded to the survey, they've been on their waiver ranging from 2005 to 2021. So all of them have had this waiver for at least 4 years. And some of the benefits that they noted in the survey were improved student attendance, allowing for individualized instruction and tutoring on Fridays, reductions in parent stress, less teacher burnout, more flexibility in scheduling for parents. And this was particularly noted in our rural districts that parents could schedule doctor's appointments and things like that on Fridays and not miss school, and reduced transportation needs. And then the only two negative impacts that anyone noted were that longer school days can be hard on the younger students in particular, and that there was sometimes low engagement in the optional Friday, programming that was provided. And finally, the respondents in Utah said that unanimously, they said that they saw either no changes or improvements in their test scores. They reported seeing little staff turnover and an increase in teacher recruitment. They all reported unanimously stable or improved attendance. No one reported decreased attendance. The top two reasons listed for the 4-day school week in Utah were attendance, improving attendance, and teacher retention. Other factors there included finance, transportation, following local schedules with either the tribes or the military bases, and to be able to provide targeted services for Fridays. And then of the respondents here locally, 3 out of 10 provide student services, some kind of student services on Fridays, and 2 provide or require some kind of teacher prep or work days or use them for parent-teacher conferences. And overall, we asked in Utah the satisfaction rating on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being very negative feelings and impacts of the 4-day week, to 10 being very positive, and the average response we got was 9.4. So overwhelmingly positive responses from our leaders here locally in Utah that are on the 4-day week. And that kind of sums it up. So if you have any questions, please let me know.
Yeah, Vice Chair Bollinger?
Thank you, Chair. AG Beal, so we have 18 waivers. That is LEA waivers. Do we know how many total schools that impacts?
Let me see. Okay. We have 1. I don't offhand because some of them are for the whole district, and I'm not sure off the top of my head how many schools are in some of those districts. So, for example, I think like Rich School District, the whole district is on the waiver. So I don't know right off the top of my head, but of the ones that I have, so I know 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I'm counting 8 schools that are within their district, but not the whole district.
Okay, perfect. That might be some information if this does move to a full board discussion that we want to have, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly.
AAG Beal, I have a question, and that was, when I've looked at similar studies and reasons, well, first of all, thank you for the research you've done on this. I think, as I was reading the rule that we're going to be considering today, it says that as a board, we actually have an obligation to consider all available data in evaluating an LEA waiver request and shall make data-driven decisions. And so I want to thank you for pulling this data and allowing it to supplement what we consider. Did you come across any research that would help guide us in terms of the 4-day week impacting students on an IEP?
I did not. That's a great question. And that's something that, if you decide that you want me to bring this to the board, that I can look into in the next month.
Okay. Any other questions from the committee? Okay. AAG Beal, thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you.
Next item on the agenda is R277-121, Board Waiver of Administrative Rules. And Ben, are you queuing that up, or is AAGBO queuing that up? Or Greg?
Thank you, Chair Carey. R277-121, we added a process for requesting the 4-day week school waiver. This is in response to HB 181 from the 2025 session that was being run by Representative Watkins. In talking with her, she mentioned if we were to put this into a rule that she would go ahead and hold on to her bill, and we could go ahead and do this without needing any legislative moves. So what we did is we took the points from her bill and moved it into R277-121. The main points that she was concerned with is that there would be 2 meetings, one prior to the board's vote and one after the board's vote. The one prior would explain the rationale for why the board was seeking this 4-day waiver, and the one after would basically explain the waiver process and what they were going to go from after the board voted yay or nay. And then we put in a deadline for both the application process and the renewal process of April 10th, which according to AAG Beal would give her enough time to process all the waivers and make sure that it was ready by the time we needed them for board meeting. And so that's the impetus behind why we're bringing this rule to the committee.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee? Vice Chair Bollinger.
Thank you, Chair. Maybe I can direct this to staff. I'm not sure who the best person to answer this question is. So is there a current rule on, I was understanding that there's a date in which local school boards had to have their schedule planned for the following year. Is that still something that is in place? Or is that just a local LEA decision? And the reason I'm asking is I just want to make sure that if there is, that this date wouldn't conflict with that date. It would still give them they align.
Aaron. Was on. Is it on? Okay, Aaron Bruff, Director of Data and Statistics. It is a local decision on the date that they have to publish their calendar. USB, we delay on getting those information. We wait until basically May timeframe to collect that information from the LEAs, and then we put it into our consolidated report. So there is not one unified state one saying you have to have your calendar. It's all based upon the LEA's process.
Chair, is it okay if I ask a question?
Please.
So, and I don't know the answer to this. So if this rule goes into effect, what exactly does it do? Does it streamline the process for waivers?
So there's already a process for waivers. What this does is it clarifies that you would have to hold 2 public meetings, one prior and one after. And that's really the difference between what we're doing now and what this rule would affect.
Okay.
And if I may explain a little more, part of the lawmakers' concern was that a lot of times during board meetings, there's not a huge participation of the community, and so she wanted to make these meetings separate from that board meeting so that there'd be a good chance that the community would get that explanation of this particular waiver, and they would have their opportunity to get their questions answered.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see. Okay, yeah, Board Member Lear.
Turn my light on.
Make sure you turn on your
I
microphone.
will do that, though, thank you. I'm kind of baffled. I talked to Amanda about this earlier, but I'm still, and you explained it, and maybe that's the best explanation we have. I'm sorry, a lot of preface to this, but the meeting afterwards seems a little beside the point, because the local boards made the decision. It's really pretty easy to spell out where do we go from here. We go to the state board. There's a form that's filled out. There are data that are reviewed by the board. The board makes a recommendation, or committee makes a recommendation. And anyway, that seems pretty straightforward. You could almost do it on a communication or a piece of paper. So the meeting afterwards feels like it's beside the point. And if this is what the legislator wants to avoid a bill, then a beside the point meeting is kind of not too much of is kind of a lesser evil. But I just wonder if we could, I don't care about 2 meetings, but I just wonder if we couldn't leave those to the discretion of the LEA, or was the legislator specific to, I want this second meeting in that place?
I can take that, Board Member Lear.
Thanks.
I was part of that meeting with her.
Okay.
And she did not seem, her major concern was just that there wasn't enough. And she was coming from a particular district that had a particular backstory between their 4-day waiver. And so her concern was just that the public was not understanding what was happening and were part of the process of communication. Whatever you decide today, my guess is that she would be fine with a communication, or with maybe including the waiver process, the description of plans to address stakeholder concerns, if that was added to another meeting or to a electronic communication, that would probably be fine. And I will take whatever comes out of committee today to her to get that feedback before it goes to full board as well. So we can do that.
Can I just follow up briefly? Chair?
Yes, please, sorry.
That's all right.
Yes.
I don't want to make a bigger deal of this than is necessary. And if we're going through the motions and just saying she wanted 2 meetings, we're having 2 meetings, and I'm just looking at this, and I almost think that 2 meetings before the committee vote, their local committee votes, their local board votes, would be maybe more productive or more helpful, or like I said, telling the LEA you have to have 2 meetings separate from your board meetings, that helps inform the committee, or the community. Sorry, keep getting my. So that's just my thinking on it. I don't want to overbake this. So, I'm not making a motion right now. I just, in the spirit of local control and the spirit of practicality, that second meeting seems beside the point. So, just a comment. Thanks. I'm trying to turn that off. There we go.
Vice Chair Bollinger?
Thank you, Chair. And I want to support the same sentiment, that trying to understand the purpose of having a meeting after that vote is held is interesting. However, it does make sense to make sure that we have the community involved and that they're aware. Like, our board voted on this. Now we're going to go to the state school board and apply for a waiver. I just want to make sure I understand lines 48 through 50, that I'm reading those correctly. So as part of the second meeting, and it says it can be held electronically, so that could even be just like a Zoom, just separate from a board meeting, which is okay. It's a little less burdensome. But it says certify that the LEA or public school notified affected school community councils and principals about the potential waiver before holding a vote to apply for the waiver. So is that saying that they just have to show the community that they talked to the community council and the principals before the local board voted? Is that how I'm reading? Is that correct?
Sorry. So so certify that the LEA or public school had notified their school community council and principals. So in this particular case that the representative was referencing, it was for an LEA waiver, and there was a feeling on her end that the principal whose school it would affect was not fully part of the process. And so just making sure that once it gets to the board, that is clear, that all of the principals that are involved and the school community council for the school that's involved was properly notified and part of the process.
You want me to make a motion?
Board member, can I just one question? I just have one question that, and I'm sorry, this is what I've been reading or focused on. Lines 54 through 64. It says here that an LEA board may not request a waiver from a board rule. And then it lists these provisions of when you cannot. To me, it would seem that is a better fit under line 14, R277, procedures for waiver requests. It's almost as a condition precedent, like before you can even request a waiver, you've got to verify that these things are not happening. And I just think for clarity, and I would seek the committee's feedback on this, that perhaps we take those provisions, lines 54 through 64, and almost make that line 15 through wherever it would normally end. But that way, it's not tucked away under these meetings, but rather, hey, before you can even come to the board, you should be doing this. And if there's no objection from the committee, I would just defer that to staff's discretion to put that together and then present that to this committee via email prior to the matter being heard before the full board.
I agree.
Okay.
That's fine.
So the motion would be, yeah. Vice Chair Bollinger?
Just a clarifying question. So are you looking just 54 through 58, or would you want that to go all the way through is it go through 64?
It would be through 64.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Reasons they can't request a waiver.
And I would also leave it to staff's discretion. If a new heading is required, to amend draft 1 by putting lines 54 to 64 at the beginning of subsection 2. Yes, and I would just add, Deputy Superintendent Nui, again, staff's discretion as to whether or not a separate heading is required, because it seems, again, there's the procedures for the waiver request. I don't know if this is a separate section. If it isn't, but I would defer to staff on that, just so you know that our staff has the liberty to look at that and make that determination. And so the motion before the body is that to amend draft 1 by putting lines 54 through 64 at the beginning of subsection 2 and direct staff to consider whether a separate subsection is necessary. Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion passes unanimously. Thank you. The next matter before the committee is item 2.4.
Chair, do we need to, we only did the amendment. We haven't moved forward, so we need to do a full motion.
I'm excited about you're right. Thank you.
And I'm,
Thank you, Vice
I
Chair.
think that we,
I'm fine to make that
Yeah.
motion if you want to. I move, there we go. I move that the committee approve the R277-121 Board Waiver of Administrative Rules, Draft 1 is amended, on first reading and forward to the board for approval on second and final reading.
Okay, the motion before the committee is that the committee approve R277-121 Board Waiver of Administrative Rules, Draft 1 as amended, on first reading and forward to the board for approval on second and final reading. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? That motion passes unanimously. The next matter is item 2.4, Board Policy 2005. This is an information discussion item on the agenda, complaints against individual board members and Board Policy 2005. Since this is my application, I would ask that Vice Chair Bollinger oversee this portion of the committee hearing.
Thank you, Chair. So there are some documents in our backups that have the current board policy about board member complaints for your reference. And Chair Carey, since this is something that you've requested, there's not necessarily a motion or a document on the table. So I'm going to just go ahead and ask you to speak to this, to begin our discussion.
Thank you, Vice Chair Bollinger. So this actually arose a while back as something that I wanted to do as we went through this procedure as outlined in 2005, I guess it was last year. And then Representative Weldon, he ran a bill, he is running a bill, HB 169, and his bill was very directional. It would say very prescriptive in what this board had to do, what actions it had to take. And several board members approached him, myself included, and asked that this board be given the opportunity to draft a more comprehensive policy. And he agreed to that. His bill was amended to basically authorize this body to make its own policy in this regard. Now, his bill has not passed yet. It may not pass. But I do think this is something that, as a body, we should take a look at and add more color to what we have in policy.
Okay, anybody want to speak? Member Lear?
Yes. I was also looking at Representative Welton's bill, and at first when I glanced at this, thought it was an action item, which would clearly have been precipitous given that that is in process, and now that it's just a discussion, I am fine about striking some kind of comfortable balance between the prescriptiveness of Representative Welton's bill and even different prescriptiveness that could come out of this. And I certainly agree that this could be, that the policy as written could be improved upon. I do think it is helpful, and having observed a number of these now taking place with complaints, we've got one notorious one, but we've had many others, including one that I was involved with. So I really want to build into this, which, as I looked at it, it's kind of implied, but I'd like to build into this policy some kind of a mediation, and that, for lack of a better word, you can call it negotiation, mediation, something, opportunity for leadership receives the complaint. And then what I've observed that has been effective is then a member or a couple of members of the board leadership talking to the individual complained against usually, and expressing what the concern was and seeing if the board member is receptive to whatever is appropriate. If it's an apology, if it's a change of behavior, if it's it could be a number of things. But I like building in a remediation, not a remediation, a mediation or a negotiation component, so that things are settled without all of the sort of elaborate procedures that could be, I thought, that are in Representative Welton's bill. So because that's still in motion or possible, I mean, you're suggesting that maybe he more formally said to you that he's going to hold the bill. I don't know if you were saying that at all. But I'd like to see what happens with his bill, and then I'd like us to have a more sort of formal or serious discussion about how this might be changed. But that whole long explanation is to say, I would still like to see a process that is less prescriptive than what Welton has explained, and that doesn't have 10 steps, that begins with leadership having a discussion with a board member, because with a board member or several, because I have seen the one that caught all of the attention was the time that it didn't work. But interestingly, I know of 5 or 6 or maybe more situations where the mediation, the informal conversation did work. And I'd rather not have an elaborate procedure that that takes a lot of board time, takes a lot of board emotion, and airs dirty laundry.
Okay, Chair Carey.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate Board Member Lear's remarks. I agree generally with what she said. I do want to clarify that no, there was no indication that he would hold his bill, but rather he did change it to give us that authority if it should pass. If, with the chair's permission, I have spoken with Debbie Davis, our chief auditor, and if it would be appropriate, Chair, if she could just take a few minutes to explain the current process as outlined in our bylaws and in Board Policy 2005, I think that would be benefit to everyone, just so we know how this process currently works, as it'll give us an understanding of how maybe we move forward.
And I don't know if you
Member-
have a comment.
No,
I
go ahead,
just
Member
wanted to
Hare.
say one thing as Debbie's coming forward. I did appreciate in this sort of discussion and background that I would like this policy and our bylaws to sync. So that's maybe something you'll speak to, but that's something we've been kind of casual about in the past. Thanks.
Debbie.
Okay, Debbie Davis, I'm the Chief Audit Executive for the board, and as you can see in Board Policy 2005, kind of the first 3 provisions, 1A, B, and C, are specific to internal audit. So we are involved in this process, and you can see the date that this policy was approved was November 2021, and that's when we sort of started seeing some concerns come in. So the board took some initiative, and again, this is the current policy. So what happens is when internal audit receives a concern against a state board member, internal audit will process that, will log it the same as we do any hotline, but then in accordance with this policy, we will look at, and it specifies, as Member Lear was saying, there are specific provisions of board bylaws and maybe even Board Policy 2004 about board member communications, and that is the criteria that applies here. So what internal audit does is a preliminary analysis to essentially say, and this is very high level, it's not an investigation, it just says, based on what we were given, and sometimes we follow up with the complainant and say, have you given us everything that you can give us? Based on everything that we're given, the allegation, and looking at the criteria in the bylaws regarding ethics and board member communication, does it seem like there is merit to the concern? And that is all internal audit is looking at is there merit here, or is this frivolous, it doesn't need to go forward, something like that. So at the end of the day, the preliminary analysis will say either refer to board leadership or do not refer to board leadership. We have 2 templates, and if we do not refer to board leadership, we still notify them and say, board leadership, we received this based on our preliminary analysis. We don't think there's merit, so we're not referring it for action, but we just want you to be aware. On the other hand, if we do you want
Can
me
we
to stop?
pause for
Yes,
just a second? I
yes.
think we have some follow-up questions.
All good.
And I always feel, so I feel like I'm interrupting, but I feel like catching you now might be a more advantageous way to talk about this. Can you give us a brief or a guesstimate of how often you refer to board leadership or don't refer to board leadership? 50% of the time, 90% of the time?
I think it might be 50-50. I know I've pulled the numbers recently and it's not coming to mind, but I think it actually might be close to 50-50.
Okay,
But
that
we do have the information, we track it, we log it, we have a database where we have this information, because there has been over time even media inquiry about how many of these are you receiving? And just so you're aware, in total, since the policy was passed, we have done 46 preliminary analyses. Now, those analyses could be related to multiple hotlines, meaning some are one-to-one. We get one allegation and there's one preliminary analysis. In other cases, I think the most we got 495 allegations regarding a similar incident, the same incident, and we did one preliminary analysis. So the number of allegations allegations can vary, but there would still be one preliminary analysis and then continuing on. So there's the,
And
we're
well, just wait a minute,
yes.
a little bit, just a
Yes.
short follow-up. And I don't need the exact number now, but I also want to suggest that that may be a skewed number because of one pretty, again, using the word again, notorious incident. So if you put that aside, if you put that one incident aside, would you still say it's about a 50-50 report to board leadership versus just address?
Yes,
internal?
it probably still is about 50-50 because that is speaking to the preliminary analysis that is done, not the number of hotlines. If it's the number of hotlines, the number would definitely be skewed. But based on just the preliminary analysis, it would not be skewed. And if I recall, I think it is close to the 50-50. And I'm happy to provide the committee with
I don't
the
need
number
detail.
at some
That's
point.
helpful information. Thank you.
Davis, one other follow-up. When you do the preliminary analysis, when you said whether it's going to move forward or not, you said you notify leadership. Do you also notify the board member of any time a complaint is made against them? Or only if there's findings?
So that is outlined in the board policy when that is to occur. So if I continue telling you, and then I'll tell you when the board member is actually made aware. And again, that's a policy decision for
Okay, does anybody
for
have
the
any other
board.
questions up to this point?
Up to that point?
So, yeah, and it's interesting because I was thinking this along the same lines as Vice Chair Bollinger. You said it's outlined in board policy, but what's outlined in board policy, if it's my understanding, is when a copy of the allegation is provided to the individual board member. Is there any other provision regarding simple notification? Right? I look at this as saying that's when a copy of the allegation is provided to the board member, but is the board member simply notified without a copy of that allegation as part of this preliminary analysis?
There's currently no provision that requires a notification, and so to date, we have not made a notification. Could that change? Absolutely, but currently there is no provision, and so that has not happened.
If I may,
Yes, please, Chair.
there's also no provision that board leadership be notified of every preliminary analysis. Is that correct?
That is correct.
But your office has made the determination to do that anyway.
Yes.
that correct?
We took some latitude, and actually that has changed. Well, a little bit of that has changed. Initially, as we were feeling our way through this, when we made the notification to say, again, there's the do not refer and the refer. And if it was a do not refer, initially the first year or so, and I'd have to go back and look at actual documents to have numbers, but we would just say, please be notified that we received a concern. We don't think there's merit, done. And I think it was about a year ago where in making the notification, we actually started attaching the allegation. So board leadership could see the allegation regardless and the preliminary analysis, even if it wasn't a do not refer. But prior to that, we weren't providing that level of detail. Now, could that go either way? Absolutely. It's not specified, but you're right. I think we made the determination, and I can't even remember if it was a prior board leadership that said it would just be helpful to get that additional level of detail. So yes, we did make a determination. Absolutely.
Go ahead, Chair Carey.
Thank you. And I want to make clear, I am not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just trying to understand the process and procedures so we have a good understanding as a committee on where we want to take this. So don't take that as it's not in writing here and you're doing it, but you're not doing it here. No, I'm just really trying to understand what's happening. Thank you, Vice Chair.
Point to that.
Go ahead,
Same
Member
issue.
Lear.
I hope that one of the things now that we're dissecting this, I would like the board member complained against informed when there's any allegation against a board member. And not in a dramatic way, just something probably from board leadership that says, please note that on this date we received this information about you. It just helps, I think, us recognize our own behavior and be a little more self-aware or be a little more cautious. So I hope that is built in to where we go with this.
Thank you. And the board member leader's comments made me think of something. What is the applicability of GRAMA at this stage? So a complaint is coming over the hotline. Now communication is taking place between your office, board leadership, perhaps the actual board member. How does all that play into the requirements under GRAMA? Because what I don't want to do is I endorse the idea of notifying someone who's been alleged of doing something wrong. I just want to make sure we're not creating a jeopardy for that person by now creating this public exchange of information, or possibly public.
Absolutely, and GRAMA is definitely, the records classification is an important component in deciding what happens here. And as mentioned, we have received GRAMA requests about this information, about the preliminary analysis and any final actions. So what we've learned and what we're currently doing, we have addressed on the preliminary analysis form what the records classification is. And what we say it is that it is protected as long as there is an investigation, if you will, open. So as long as this is open, and we would say then going through the full process in Board Policy 2005 until a final decision has been made, right? And so if it's a do not refer, there's no merit, then that could be a final decision. Or if it's go to board leadership's doing things, that's still open until, if it even goes to an executive session of the board for discussion and then there's a final action, it's open until that. We did put on the preliminary analysis form that once the investigation or the process has concluded, then at that point, the record could be public. And so we acknowledge that the classification of the record can change depending on the timing and where we are in the process. Now, of course, Representative Welton's bill addresses that records classification needs to be looked at. And for other ethics commissions, the records associated with the detail records, those are private. For all other ethics commissions, just there's nothing specific about the State Board of Education. But in his bill 169, it does talk about what is the records classification. And I think it tries to make it all consistent by saying these should be private, except for a summary report at the end, which could be public. So did that address your question, Chair Carey?
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Vice Chair.
One other follow-up. So if in this process we were talking about notifying a board member, is there a level of interference in a preliminary investigation if you're letting a board member know what the complaint is? Would part of that need to be confidential at some point, just to say, yes, there's been a complaint about it, we're just making you aware we're doing a preliminary investigation, and then kind of keep them informed along the way? Or is it okay to tell them, here's the complaint and here's the information? Can you speak to that?
Sure, that's a great question as well. And I think part of the question with that is should the preliminary analysis, should any subsequent investigation be independent? And if it should, then you want to gather information, but you also don't want to compromise or introduce bias into that investigatory process. So I think we'd want to be very clear, whether it's in board policy or however the board wants to outline it, exactly when should the board member know, what level of I don't want to say interference, that's not the right word, but providing information or being involvement is the better word. When should the board member be involved or provide their side of things? And that maybe takes us to, if internal audit does refer to board leadership then has the next step, and it's very broad what is currently in Board Policy 2005. It's very broad. Board leadership takes that, looks at it, and they can decide, do we want to do further investigation? And it's not really even stipulated, just as board leadership has it. They decide if there's merit and it's going to move forward, whatever that looks like or means, then they'll do whatever needs to be done. And if it's going to go to the board, then the board member is given, again, the copy of the allegation, the preliminary analysis. They can provide a response. They can provide documentation at that point. So to answer your question, at that point, they are involved currently. Should it happen earlier in the process? Should it just be a notification? And that notification will say, you will have the opportunity for due process and to provide information if it moves forward. All of that could be either outlined in board policy, however the board wants to address it to ensure consistency in what that process looks like.
Okay, Member Laird, did you have a
Yeah, one more
comment?
thought. Sorry, we are really nitpicking, but when it's just a concept at this point. But first of all, we could address grandma depending on how we feel about making that stuff public by just making it a verbal notification from leadership to the board member, and noting the date. And then there's not the complicated grandma issue, though an investigation covers it. The other, and I guess I'd prefer that process, again, as we anticipate developing this. The second thing that I think is always troubling about these discussions about investigations is that I think you're always weighing due process for the individual complained against versus an adequate investigation process. And I'm probably one that errs a little more on the side of due process for the person complained against. So I believe, and again, subject to how we proceed, that I would like the individual notified in verbally, and then also notified at the same time. This is going to be this will be an independent investigation. So you won't know any more until some point at which time you'll be asked for your own side of the story. Because I think it's super important that the board member, there's sort of a general saying that, if you've never been complained against, you're probably not doing your job. So I've been involved in many complaints and on both sides of them. And I do find it very unfair and disconcerting to have an investigation taking place over sometimes weeks with never being notified that you're being investigated formally or informally. So I really value notifying the individual, but being very clear that you won't be involved until X point when you absolutely will be able to tell your side of the story.
Okay, any other comments before we let Debbie continue?
And I apologize, where are we in the policy, like in that process? I apologize.
Yes. So if you look at D, it says, so going from C is where internal audit shall refer. And then D is board leadership then reviews the referred analysis, right? And that's where, and again, that's broad. What does a review mean? What does it look like? Does it include additional investigation? And sometimes historically that might have been done by one of our AAGs, right? And then board leadership is going to make that determination if it moves forward. So there's still a point there where it's like, no, this is done. We're done with it. But if it will move forward, which is E, then, and there's those two provisions, right? Provide the individual board member a copy of the allegation and the supporting information, which would be the preliminary analysis, anything that's come from an investigation. And then the second provision under E is that request that the individual board member provide a response with any evidence they would like to provide. So that's the next step. Internal audit's not involved at that point, so I can't speak to exactly how that happens. Should there be timing requirements, how that happens? What does it look like? There is some consideration just based on history with this. If there is an incident that is well publicized and you have people saying, hey, we want information, or what does this look like? Or is the board taking action? And probably all of you as board members could speak to the pressure that comes from that. Like, maybe it's just, no, our policy is it's going to take this long. We have to go to a board meeting, which starts to get to F and then G on the next page, right? Where board leadership is going to provide the information from E. So the allegation, supporting documentation, the response, any evidence related to the response, and then that moves to a discussion in executive session of board meeting.
Vice Chair.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and no, and I just don't want to get too far ahead. Could we go back to that provision E? So audit's made its determination. It's been forwarded to board leadership. Board leadership now is weighing this. Is there any objection or reason why we couldn't suggest if board leadership determines an allegation will move forward, audit shall, and then I and double I? Because it seems like this information is being provided to board leadership and then being provided to the board member. Can't that all just be done through audit, or is there a reason why we're saying board leadership there?
I'm happy to provide my opinion, which may or may not be right, but
Go ahead, Debbie, and then we'll come back to you, Member Lear.
okay.
I'm just looking for best practice.
Sure.
It would seem like we would want the audit committee to do that, but again, I'm looking for your experience and wisdom.
So once we're to letter E, internal audit has essentially passed the baton to board leadership. And from there, we're not as involved in the conversations, right? In D, whether they think, you know, hey, is this going to move forward? So historically, internal audit has not been involved in any of those conversations. And I think that is why, again, the current policy, board leadership is notifying the board member about, hey, you know, here you go, this is where we're at. Would it be appropriate for internal audit to do it? Anything in this policy could change, you know, as developed by the board if there's a better process. So could internal audit, as long as there's not additional information that was gleaned when board leadership made its determination to move this forward. Because right now internal audit's not privy if there is, but if we were privy, could we? Absolutely yes.
Vice Chair, if I may, and thank you for that. So, if only this committee had a member of board leadership on it, we could. So and Molly, I don't want to, Vice Chair Hart, but I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm thinking that as busy as board leadership is, and I'm talking about just these two functions, is that something that could be better handled by
So-
audit?
Yeah, so I've tried to just listen because it needs to be the will of the board what board leadership does. So I've not wanted to weigh in. What happens in actual practice is exactly as C.A. Davis is talking. They do the initial, and then they pass the baton, and then it becomes the work of board leadership. We could take the baton and have our conversations and then direct audit to do the next step. But every time there's that transition, it actually slows down the work. The other thing is we keep bumping up against this, what is board leadership tasked with doing as the work of the board? And the more that we put on staff and we take off board leadership, the less it belongs in board leadership's purview. I don't know how to explain it real well, but I get concerned. Yes, it would be great if this is just a matter of process for our staff, but remember, it's also putting audit in a position where they are now somewhat in the weeds of dealing with the very board that employs them. So,
But if I may,
I'm in the queue, by the way, if you guys just want to keep.
yeah.
We'll let you in soon.
Vice,
Yeah, go ahead.
But I'm just saying, and I understand, I think I understand, but all I'm saying is, in terms of the paperwork dissemination, why is it so essential that board leadership provide the individual member or request the individual? Because I think that audit just has a better okay.
Let me give you a different perspective.
Okay.
Yeah, let's go to Member Lear, and then I have a comment.
Hold on. Thank
Yes.
you very much. I see it differently than that. I really like Member Vice Chair Hart's point about audit being, the board as a whole is the boss, it supervises audit. So I don't think audit is appropriate. I also think we have to remember that these complaints could affect the reputation, perhaps the property right of the individual board member if it becomes serious enough. So I think it's very important that either somebody at the level, in the leadership level, is now taking over, despite all that's on their plates, or that is somehow passed to the AAGs. I know that's more similar to the way the bar handles its complaints. And I think because the information, it could be so personal so reputational that it needs to go to board leadership or to the AAGs and not to audit. No disrespect, bless their hearts, very qualified, but they're not in a position of authority like board leadership or a legal authority who is really, I think, the more appropriate investigator if things have gone to the level of this needs to be continued to be investigated.
I just wanted to also make a comment. So on D, board leadership shall review the referred analysis. So it's gone to the board leadership at that point to refer to determine if it, if they're going to review it. And then on E, if they're the ones determining the allegation is going to move forward, then because it's in their hands, I see what Vice Chair Hart is saying, that if they've had it, then we go back to audit to then go back to the person. So Vice Chair Hart.
One idea, and it also goes to the intent of providing the individual board member a copy of the allegation. And if the concern about that is that the board member has a copy, then the board member could get a copy earlier. Like, we could move that off of, okay, all right.
I'm just trying to understand, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Go ahead.
I'm moving on. Again, I was just curious, not looking for a change, but if we can go back to D, board leadership shall review the referred analysis considering the criteria set forth in board bylaws, Article 4, Section 12. So I called that up, and Article 4, Section 12 of our bylaws basically is, hey, these are all the horrible things that can happen to you, from a beat down to tar and feathering and being kicked off the board. Like, there's really... Oh, you can't be that's with the tar and feathering and the beatdown are okay, but not being kicked off the board. That's not within our purview. But I look at 12, and 12 just says that, hey, these are all the leadership may authorize any of the following, and it lists those. But when I read D, it says, hey, when you get this referral, this is the criteria that board leadership is supposed to employ in determining whether or not that moves forward. But then when I go here, 90% of it is, these are the penalties that can happen, except for it says, a board member may be reprimanded or the actions of a member censured for any violation of law, policy, bylaws, or any other conduct which tends to injure the good name of the board, following adequate due process. But we never define the criteria. We just use that catch-all that board leadership should be using due process. Are you familiar with any provision in our bylaws or policies which basically articulate that criteria referred to in subsection D?
We're going to actually go to, I think Vice Chair Hart just has additional information, then we'll come back to you.
Yeah, so the criteria is exactly what you just listed. So then we have to say, is this, or this, or this, or that laundry list that you just read?
Yeah.
That is the criteria. Like, do we think it's one of those items? And if so, we move forward. I have a better answer for the question you asked earlier.
But wait, how can you decide what the punishment should be if we haven't used due process to determine whether a punishment is?
No, what you're deciding at that point is, does the incident qualify as one of those things?
So I just want to clarify. So you're basically saying on D, they're reviewing it, and on part E, when they determine if it moves forward, you're looking at that checklist and says, yes, it meets the criteria. Now we'll move forward. Is that correct?
D is when you decide if it qualifies. It isn't at all, because you haven't done due process. You have not yet gotten the information back to even go to, say, a consequence stage. All you're doing is deciding whether or not it qualifies, so that
Qualifies
you then
for what? Qualifies for
to
what?
ask for more information to move forward. Like,
To,
you're, all
to
you're,
continue to be investigated?
yes.
But what
And-
standard is, I'm sorry, Vice Chair, what standard is being used to assess that is my
Yeah.
question.
Let's go ahead and go to CA Davis.
Well, I want to, can I answer my question?
sure.
Or
It's almost like ready, fire, aim. Like, it's like, it seems backwards, so I'm missing something.
The reason that we don't send it back to audit is because we try to keep the business of the board at the board level, and we try not to involve staff in the board, so to speak, politics. For lack of a more refined way to say it, that is the reason that we don't send it back and ask audit staff to figure out our politics. I just wanted to answer that.
Okay, let's go ahead and see if CA Davis has anything to add to that.
Okay, I think I can add. I think I understand what you're saying, Member Carey, and it's, so if 12 are essentially the remedies, the things that can be taken, what is the criteria that, for example, internal audit, we get a concern, what are we weighing that against? What criteria? And right now it says Article 4.12, and really the criteria that internal audit weighs is we look at everything in Article 4. We say, okay, this is Article 4, board member ethics. So that's maybe, it's like, maybe we should leave off 12 and it's just like, it's Article 4, it's board member ethics. That's what this is intended for. So that's the criteria. And then is there merit based on that criteria, right? Whatever the action was, violated something in Article 4, and then it's moving forward, and then it's considering, okay, then what action should the board consider? You know, is it a reprimand? Is it something else? Does that make sense? Does that help at all?
It does, and Vice Chair, if I may, but when it gets to D, if we could call up D. D? Yeah, 1D. When it gets to D, audit is already out, right? Like, you've already turned this over to the board, so it's not the criteria that audit would use. It's the criteria that board leadership should use. I guess what I'm saying is we reference Article 4, Section 12. In that language of Article 4, Section 12, it says board leadership needs to use due process. My question is, how are we defining due process, or if we define it? Because if board leadership is supposed to be using due process, where is that standard articulated? Or is it just well, everybody knows what due process is?
Isn't E2 due process? Yeah, I think it is.
I wonder if this back to what Member Lear was talking about, where maybe this is where if there's more investigating or more data gathered, I kind of hear what you're saying, Chair Carey, is that if leadership is giving them an opportunity to respond and maybe there's more evidence, then is it leadership that then's investigating that evidence, or does AAG need to get involved to review that? Do you feel like there's a piece missing there, or you just feel like the respondent is not giving an opportunity to the due process? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, thank you. Yes. So I get, my concern is just, there's several determinations that board leadership has to make. I read D, and maybe this is where it's at. I look at D and say, D receives this complaint, and then they have to make a determination as to whether or not it moves forward. Right? That's a crucial juncture. My question is, what is the standard that board leadership at that juncture is using to decide whether or not to move forward? Now, I get the part that they're going to look at the allegation, they're going to look at where there are witnesses, the weight of the evidence, but doesn't due process that's required in our bylaws also mandate that certain protections are in place and followed for the individual to whom the allegation is made against? That's the part I'm trying to figure out. Because if we're just going to look at one side, it's like an indictment, right? Only one side gets to present its evidence. Only one side gets to present its interpretation of the law. But if we're saying due process applies, to me that means both sides have a chance to say, hey, before board leadership makes a decision as to whether or not this should move forward, this is what has to be weighed. I don't see that in our current structure.
So, if I may, so if that part about being able to respond was connected more with step D, is that what you're saying? You're saying that they're making a determination without having the full information?
Yeah, and I think that could be the answer, which is we just put that in a, no, you're right, Vice Chair, but see, in E, it says, if board, an allegation will move forward, if at that point we're saying that's when due process applies, because now they have a chance to be heard, what is the standard that's being used to determine should it move forward or not? Because once they determine it moves forward, then we're saying, hey, you get all this due process, you get all these protections. But when we consider as board leadership whether or not this moves forward, what protection does the member have where this allegation is made against? And again, Board Member Lear has the benefit of experience and perspective. The one incident that I remember, I was very troubled by what I perceived as just a very, we're going to learn this as we go. And I just want to make sure that we have a process that is just fair to everyone. That's where this is coming from.
Thank you. We'll go to Member Lear, and then we'll go back to
Standing.
C.A. Davis.
I can't sit all day for 2 days. I'm using the analogy, I've not done board member investigations, but I've done a lot of student disciplinary investigations and some employee investigations. And there's just kind of a general standard. We can cite the case law if we want. Let me just also preface this by saying it's a good thing we've got the rest of the meeting to discuss this.
I didn't want to take the whole.
Because I think we are way nitpicky for something that we don't even have on paper yet. But having said that, that your due process is more minimal until, and again, I don't mean to sound lecturing, but the case law says that due process is much more minimal until something is poised to be taking away something from you. So, yes, it might be better to have the little I, little two I's under D, but I believe that because we're spreading these out, but this probably could have happened in the matter of a half an hour. So at the point that board leadership is saying, does this meet one of our criteria? And it doesn't, maybe the criteria in our bylaw needs to be refined too. And we can't be looking to that and saying it doesn't meet these criteria if they're not particularly good right now. So maybe they need to be refined. But at the point that leadership is saying which criteria might this fit that inspires greater investigation, I don't think there's a need at that for more than we've notified the individual, and probably it just came out as a natural consequence of notifying the individual. He says, she says, oh my gosh, that's way overblown, it's way out of context. So she has an implied right to respond. And that's minimal due process. And then the board leadership says, thank you very much, I think we'll proceed with our investigation. So I think that the due process is adequate to D, and then the board determines that it continues to investigate. And at that point, right under little I and two little i's, the board member does get more extensive due process because there's increasingly more at stake. So I think we are sort of spreading this out, making this as sounding like a month process without a board member being able to respond, when really it's a pretty compressed experience until you get down to board saying, yeah, there's something here to investigate further. So that's my interpretation of adequate due process. But I think that we keep referring to the bylaws, and I think you make the sort of implied point, Member Carey, that we need to also look at those and see if those criteria are really what we want to be. Are they really satisfactory? Because referring to our previous incident, I guess I'm a little easier on board leadership and the whole board than you might be, because it was a brand new experience. And it was unlikely. And let me just conclude with one last thing, and that is that I feel like these are, like I said briefly before, these are investigations that could really harm a board member. So I want to make sure that the right people with the right legal skills are investigating. And possibly board leadership could be those people because they have a significant leadership role. I think more appropriately, and think they would do this, is involving those who have the legal skills to investigate. Because investigate can be a highly technical term, it can be a really casual term. But when there's so much at stake for a board member, I think it should be somebody with the legal skills to do the more legal type of investigation.
C.A. Davis.
Thanks, I've spit popcorn all over my desk now.
Sure. This is my auditor perspective, which is not a legal perspective. But in looking at board bylaws, as was mentioned, so Article 4 and 12, and it says, following adequate due process, right, that's when the action can be taken. So if we compare that then with what's in Board Policy 2005, where it's saying, okay, we need the due process before an action is going to be taken. The action would be taken, as in F, it says, go to executive session. That's when you're going to determine the action. And so then E and little I and little I2, there's due process there. So perhaps technically, what is stated in Board Bylaw Article 412 is met there. That said, with D, and it's just shall review and determine if it will move forward, could there be additional, what does that mean? How do you get there? Who should know what, when at that point? For consistency, for ease of this is the process, could that be blown out, additional information there? Absolutely, to consider. And again, maybe board bylaw needs to be updated. Maybe under Representative Welton's bill, it will need to be anyway, as will this board policy. But potentially a technical reading possibly of this article in the bylaws, it could be met if the action that is being referred to is it will go to executive session. The action will take place after you come out of executive session, perhaps. But if that's where the action's being taken, then E, little I, and little I2 would precede that as a due process, possibly.
Go ahead.
Vice Chair, thank you. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I just want to stress that this is not about seeking punishment. This is really about making sure that everyone is treated fairly in the process. And I think that in practice, we're much better than maybe what's outlined in our current policy. But I am just bewildered by the fact that the policy that we cite for due process is the one that contains all the penalties. That juxtaposition seems odd. So, but I understand it, and that's the purpose of this discussion, and I'm done making that point. Thank you.
Okay. So it sounds like you feel, because when we look at our bylaws, on that first line of 12, it says a member may be reprimanded or the actions of a board member censured for any violation of law, policy, bylaws, or any other conduct. So it's the determining what that's the piece, because all of a sudden I can see what you're saying. It goes to the consequences within that, but it's really when you're saying what are we comparing this to or looking at to find the violation? It's looking at the laws, the policies, bylaws, or any other conduct. That's the piece right there. That's the determining factor. Is that
That's exactly
a fair
right.
statement?
And that's what I mean. I think in practice, we do it works because we're doing it, I think, differently than maybe outlined. But again, that's my interpretation, and hopefully we can have the opportunity to
That is a very good point.
to make this better.
So it sounds like from our discussion today, it does sound like there is some appetite to revisit this and update it. I do think that we're kind of on hold today a little bit until Welton's bill. We see what happens with that. Doesn't mean that we wouldn't move forward if it doesn't pass. It sounds like there's still an appetite to move forward with clarifying this before. Is this something that you would like us to potentially make a motion to bring this back at our next meeting?
Thank you, Vice Chair. Yeah, with the committee's assent, I think, as Vice Chair Bollinger said, I do think that we can improve what we have. I don't want to make a motion that asks C.A. Davis to do it or Ben to do it, but I would look for your direction. If we wanted basically a first draft of what was discussed today, what would be the best process to do that without overburdening?
Well, you would certainly just be able to make a motion to direct staff to start on something if there are specific points that you want to include in that. I mean, you could include that in the motion. I've been taking notes about the issues that I've heard that we could try and translate into a draft, but if you want, I guess it depends on how close you want the draft to be to reflect certain things, and you'd want to provide specifics on that in the motion if there were specific things that you want to address in the draft.
Member Laird, did you have a comment?
Yes. I think we ought to direct staff. It's not, I don't think it's our role to direct which staff person to do it. And I think there have been, anybody can listen to this online. Elise is here, Ben is here. They typically work with rules and policies. I think our role would be to direct staff to develop something consistent with our discussion points, and then we can actually make amendments to things that come about. So we're not just speculating.
And with that in mind, are we looking at asking this to come back as a discussion item after the first draft, or would we look at that draft?
I think it's direct. My idea would be, my motion would be, were I making a motion, would be that it comes back as an action item once we get a draft.
Yeah.
Back to committee.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry, Vice Chair.
Yeah.
I'm
just waiting to see if somebody
No,
wants to make a.
I'll make the motion.
Ben, did you have another comment?
I was just going to say that bringing it back as an action item doesn't require the committee to take action. You can
Right.
discuss and push it out if it's not ready.
Exactly. You want me to make the motion?
Sure.
I move that the committee directs, and we don't directly direct staff, but the committee recommends to the superintendent that the superintendent directs staff to provide a draft of policy 2005 with any suggested changes, and I don't know if this is compound, so I'm not sure this is.
a motion written up, is that
Oh, never mind. I'll just go with that. Thank you. Let me make my life easier.
Do you want to see if that reflects what you're trying to
Yes,
say?
The committee recommends that the superintendent staff recommend that the superintendent staff develops a draft of board. Okay, yes, I think it does. I move that the committee recommends that the superintendent staff develops a draft of board policy 2005 with changes that reflect the discussion had during today's committee meeting, and bring that draft to the April Law and Licensing Committee as an action item. I'm putting this out of context too, which may include some necessary suggestions for policy or for bylaw number 4, I think it is. Is that too compound? Is that okay? Okay. I just don't want us to get hung up on the fact that the bylaw isn't working well with the policy. So let's look at them both at the same time.
Okay, so the motion is that the committee recommend that superintendent directs staff to develop a draft of board policy 2005 with changes that reflect the discussion had during today's committee meeting, and bring that draft to the April Law and Licensing Committee as an action item, which may include other suggestions for changes to bylaw 4. Okay, with that, let's take.
Wait, Deputy Superintendent, no, he winced. I didn't know if that was. Oh.
Did you have any questions about that. Okay, did
Okay.
that clearly?
It
Or
does.
two-
I hesitated a little bit at the deadline because they've got probably 50 rules to review that legislators will be very interested in. So I hope we can take this understanding that the timing might be a little delayed.
Does this reflect to just say to a future law and licensing instead of the April? Is that,
I know there would be people here that would not want it put off indefinitely, but I guess I would prefer April or May.
so let's have April on that, and then let's go to, if there's discussion to that motion.
Do you think it's doable, Louise, by April? Okay.
Even if it wasn't doable, would you say yes? That's my fear.
I think that's
but-
a yes.
She's
The
giving
will
it
of
to
the
me,
board.
she'll say yes.
I'd rather have a good draft come in May than a half-assed draft. Sorry. That Mark Huntsman would just be jumping all over me.
Sounds like there's an investigation to be started. Any comments or discussion? Okay, let's go ahead and take a vote. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, that motion passes unanimously, and I will pass the time back, or the microphone back to Chair Carey. Is that everything we have?
I think just a final motion, so
Okay. Motion to adjourn.
all those in favor?
Aye.
I did not take attendance at the beginning of the committee, but I do want to note that all members were present at the start of committee. Thank you. Adjourned.
Oh, we managed to shred that out.
Well, that was a good action item for a meeting we didn't have as much on.
Yeah, that just worked out because, yeah.
Oh, better turn this off.
But I'll have cats and a pool, and it's gonna be fun. So it's my husband's spring break.
No,
He's a kind of a nerdy guy, too.
What's that? So are they still online?
No money.
You guys, you might want to stay away from your mics. The
We're
meeting is still
online.
transmitting.